Time to look at the short story Lucerne by Tolstoy. Now, the first thing I noticed about this, I've been reading this from a book of Tolstoy short stories that is arranged in chronological order for when he wrote them. This book, 1857, comes immediately after another short story called The Proprietor, or The Landowner's Mourning. Couldn't help but notice the other short story there. The protagonist in that one has the same last name as the protagonist in this one, Nekhludoff. And in that previous short story, that protagonist leaves off thinking that he might have made a mistake by choosing to prioritize and stay home and take care of his homestead rather than traveling and being everything that high society wants him to be. So I finished that story. It leaves off literally with him daydreaming about what he would do if he could travel the world. And then this next story, we see a character by the very same name in Switzerland. So I thought that was interesting, and I have my own personal theory that this Nekhludoff in Switzerland is the daydream of that Nekhludoff who chose to stay home and take care of his farm. So there's the first thing I noticed. Quote from the last page of The Proprietor, quote, "He flies freely and easily, always farther and farther away, and sees below him golden cities bathed in clear effulgence, and the blue sky with bright stars, and a blue sea with white sails, and smoothly and pleasantly he flies, always further and further away. Splendid, he whispers to himself, and the thought, why am I not Ilyushka, comes to him," end quote. Ilyushka being the son of one of the peasants, who rather than being a serf at home becomes a traveling merchant. One of the first things to notice about this protagonist Nekhludoff in the Lucerne story, I think introspective would be the right word for it. He has more thoughts about what he sees around him than he has words for other people. And a lot of those thoughts are pessimistic. He dislikes small talk, he dislikes the pretentiousness of the society around him. He's in this hotel surrounded by wealthy Englishmen who care about status and appearance. He talks about how much he dislikes the dining etiquette and this polite silence all around him. Quote, "Such dinners invariably depress me. I dislike them, and before they are over, I become blue," end quote. Quote, "It always seems to me as if I were in some way to blame, just as when I was a boy I was set upon a chair in consequence of some naughtiness and bidden, ironically, 'Now rest a little while, dear young one,'" end quote. That second quote was about the feeling of embarrassment from even talking too loud. Which, yeah, I've been in environments where that is relatable. And then something happens that completely changes the tone of his thoughts. There is a traveling singer who comes to the street in front of the hotel and starts playing music. Quote, "These strains had an immediate and enlivening effect upon me. It was as though bright, cheerful light had poured into my soul," end quote. And importantly, he notices that everyone around him, everyone else in the hotel who can hear this music, is also greatly affected by it. Quote, "All it seemed were under the influence of the same feeling that I myself experienced. All stood in silence around the singer and listened attentively," end quote. Quote, "Among the crowd, and above on the Schweizerhof, and nearby on the boulevard, were heard frequent murmurs of approval, though generally the most respectful silence reigned," end quote. The Schweizerhof being the name of the hotel. Now, after he sings for a little while, he says, "Hey, I'm thirsty, I could use some wine," and he tries to pass his hat around to collect a little bit of money, and no one gives him anything. Quote, "The crowd laughed heartlessly," end quote. Quote, "The crowd cackled with laughter and satisfaction," end quote. The protagonist notes that the singer asks 3 times over if anyone can give him anything, and everyone who was enchanted by his music just moments ago suddenly starts making fun of him. Quote, "I was overmastered by a feeling of pain, of bitterness, and above all, of shame for the little man, for the crowd, for myself, as though it were I who had asked for money and received none, as though it were I who had been turned to ridicule," end quote. I like that word overmastered. I don't know if it's Tolstoy himself or if it's the translator, but that word overmastered comes up again and again in this story. Quote, "I could not explain the feeling that overmastered me, only there was something like a stone, from which I could not free myself, weighing down on my soul and oppressing me," end quote. And I did notice that the word soul was used there. More on that later. But anyway, the protagonist feels sorry for this singer, and as the singer walks away back into the city, away from the Schweizerhof, the protagonist quickly rushes outside and tries to follow the singer. And as he's following, he reflects, of course, how anyone could be so heartless after hearing such beautiful music. Quote, "And it seemed as though all of them alike found it so comfortable and easy, so light and free to be alive in the world, that I involuntarily contrasted them with the wandering minstrel, who, weary, perhaps hungry, full of shame, was retreating before the laughing crowd. And then suddenly I comprehended what it was that oppressed my heart with such a load of heaviness. and I felt indescribable anger against these people." End quote. So Nekhludoff catches up to the minstrel, tells him to come back to the Schweizerhof, I'll give you dinner, has a conversation with him. The description of the minstrel's physicality I thought was interesting. Just because it was so vivid, I don't think it's an overly important part of the plot. He's described as being short, almost a dwarf in stature, but muscular with black hair. He says he had been a singer for 18 years, because long ago he hurt his hand and that prevented him from doing a lot of different kinds of work. So Nekhludoff has this conversation with him about what he does. Quote, "I've noticed that wandering minstrels, acrobats, and even jugglers delight in calling themselves artists, and several times I hinted to my comrade that he was an artist, but he did not at all accept the designation, but with perfect simplicity looked upon his work as a means of existence." End quote. So it becomes gradually apparent that the two characters have a little difference in attitude there, and Nekhludoff starts asking him about his homeland of Italy, south of Switzerland. Quote, "Well, you find rather generous gentlemen there, don't you?" I went on to say, anxious to make him share my resentment against the guests of the Schweizerhof. My question utterly failed of the effect that I had expected. It had not entered his head to be indignant with them. End quote. This is an important distinction. While Nekhludoff feels anger towards everyone who took his music for granted, the singer himself, not so much. They keep talking, they get to talking about the singer's homeland of Italy, a little bit south of Switzerland. Nekhludoff is surprised to find that there are actually laws prohibiting street performing in some of these places that he's been to, that the singer has been to, because he travels around from place to place. The singer still lightheartedly talks about one time that he was even in jail for a month because of it. Quote, "If I were not a cripple, I would work. But what harm do I do to anyone in the world by my singing?" End quote. And it's at this point that the waiters, who had thus far been showing subtle signs of rudeness, do something even more rude. One of the waiters comes up, sits with them at the table, and he puts his elbows on the table. And it's at this point that Nekhludoff starts unleashing quite a bit of pent-up anger. Quote, "I asked him why he had so humbly bowed when he had met me before, and now, because I was sitting with the traveling minstrel, he came and took his place near us so rudely." End quote. And it is that reason, because he was there with the minstrel. Here's a quote from much later in the text that explains the social dynamic pretty well. Quote, "But in society the lackey is better dressed than the minstrel and insults him with impunity. I am better dressed than the lackey and insult him with impunity. The porter considers me higher, but the minstrel lower than himself. When I made the minstrel my companion, he felt he was on equality with us, and behaved rudely. I was impudent to the porter, and the porter acknowledged that he was inferior to me. The waiter was impudent to the minstrel, and the minstrel accepted the fact that he was inferior to the waiter." End quote. But back to Nekhludoff letting his anger go here. Quote, "I was entirely overmastered by that boiling, angry indignation, which I enjoy in myself, and which sometimes I endeavor to stimulate when it comes over me." End quote. There's that word again, overmastered. Quote, "Because it has an exhilarating effect upon me." End quote. And that right there, I hope you caught it, enjoying the indignation, stimulating purposely the indignation. During Nekhludoff's inner monologue, he even says, "my enemy, the waiter," at one point, going so far as to call that man his enemy and enjoying the anger that he's feeling. That is an important detail to notice in this story. And what does the minstrel do while Nekhludoff is going off on this angry tirade? Quote, "The minstrel's face presented a most pitiable, terrified expression, and evidently he did not understand why I was angry, and what I wanted, and he urged me to let him go away as soon as possible." End quote. Quote, "Not for all the world would I have held my peace." End quote. I was a little amused going through this the second time and catching that line, "not for all the world," implying that maybe for something outside of the world he would. More on that later. Quote, "If at that moment I had been at Sevastopol, I should have taken delight in devoting myself to slaughtering and killing in the English trench." End quote. Of course, because most of the guests at the Schweizerhof are English. Tolstoy himself, if you don't already know, wrote another short story called Sevastopol Sketches. This is because he was himself a veteran. He was himself present at the Siege of Sevastopol. If you haven't read that, I do encourage you to do so. But yes, most of Tolstoy's early short stories reflected on military life, because the military stuck with him so much. Or rather, memories of the military, memories of war. But back to the story, Nekhludoff, during his angry spiel, barges his way into another fancier dining room, because he's angry that they weren't immediately offered that fancy dining room. No, they were given a dining room for more lower class hotel guests. Sits at a table near one of the English guests. The Englishman gets up and walks away. Quote, I waited with pleasurable anticipation for someone to come and order us out, for then I could have found a full outlet for my indignation. But fortunately, though at the time I felt injured, we were left in peace." End quote. Eventually, he finishes his dinner. The minstrel and him go his separate ways. He makes his way back up to his room, and then he realizes he's still too worked up to sleep. Quote, "I once more went down into the street with the intention of walking until I should have recovered my equanimity, and I must admit, with the secret hope that I might accidentally come across the porter or the waiter." End quote. And as he's walking, he has this long reflection, and this is where the important part of the story comes in, because the author uses this as an opportunity to make the reader go back and reflect on what happened. Nekhludoff says that poetry is the best thing in the world, but the Schweitzerhof guests, if they had their choice, they would choose money over poetry, or at least they say they would. But, quote, "Why have you all left your fatherland, your relatives, your money-making trades and occupations, and come to this little Swiss city of Lucerne? Why did you, all this evening, gather on the balconies and in respectful silence listen to the little beggar's song?" End quote. Quote, "One thing compels you to do it, and it will forever have a stronger influence than all the other impulses of life. The longing for poetry which you know. The longing for poetry which you know, which you do not realize, but feel, always will feel, so long as you have any human sensibilities." End quote. And here's another quote that's interesting, quote, "But children look upon life in a healthy way. They recognize and love what men ought to love, and what gives us happiness." End quote. First of all, I compared that to the parts of the New Testament where Jesus says, "Let the children come to me." But second of all, I saw that word ought, and I recognized another of Tolstoy's writings that heavily relied upon the word ought. And I have to wonder again if this was Tolstoy himself or if this was the translator. But I thought back to Death of Ivan Ilyich, "Living as Men Ought to Live," one of the core quotes of that book. Quote, "But life has so deceived and perverted you that you ridicule the only thing you really love, and you seek for what you hate, and what gives you unhappiness." End quote. Serving what you hate, that has similarities to a part of Paul's writings, the Apostle Paul, where it says he does what he does not want to do, or something to that effect. But this protagonist is not quite there yet. He's still at a sort of hedonistic mindset, I would describe it as, not quite an Epicurean mindset, although very similar, I would say, but not quite an exact overlap. Now, the protagonist reflecting back on the facts of the event, quote, "This is an event which the historians of our time ought to describe in letters of inextinguishable flame. This event is more significant and more serious, and fraught with far deeper meaning than the facts that are printed in the newspapers and histories." End quote. Quote, "A wretched, pitiable creature is a man with his craving for positive solutions thrown into this everlastingly tossing, limitless ocean of good and evil, of combinations and contradictions. For centuries, men have been struggling and laboring to put the good on one side and the evil on the other. Centuries will pass, and no matter how much the unprejudiced mind may strive to decide where the balance lies between good and evil, the scales will refuse to tip the beam, and there will always be equal quantities of good and evil on each side." End quote. Strikingly similar to Solzhenitsyn's writing. If you remember Book 1, I think it was chapter 3 or 4, The Blue Caps, talking about the mindset of someone who serves the state and arrests and accuses his neighbors based on personal gain. The line between good and evil runs through every human heart. Solzhenitsyn wrote that it can vacillate throughout someone's lifetime. There could be more good than evil during one season in life, there could be more evil than good during another season, but both will still be there. And I know for a fact Solzhenitsyn read Tolstoy, so I have to wonder if Solzhenitsyn himself was as moved by this particular short story as I am now. But the protagonist keeps reflecting, quote, "Whose wit is so great as to comprehend and weigh all the facts in the irretrievable past, and who can find any circumstance in which there is no union of good and evil." End quote. Sounds sort of similar to the book of Job, doesn't it? Also sounds similar to the book of Ecclesiastes, in a way. The protagonist answers his own question, quote, "Only the infallible guide we have, the universal spirit, which penetrates all collectively and as units, which has endowed each of us with the craving for the right." End quote. I thought it was funny he used the word guide there instead of God. I also took notice that the word spirit was capitalized. Again, I don't know if that was Tolstoy or the translator, but endowed all of us with the craving for the right. Right there, Tolstoy affirms natural law and universal morality, which are two things that I hit on a lot, but Tolstoy here does it beautifully and without even name-dropping the term itself, and without even name-dropping God himself. Quote, "And this one unerring, inspiring voice rings out louder than the noisy, hasty development of culture," end quote. God is eternal. And this is what I love about Tolstoy. He can write something beautiful like this, or like Death of Ivan Ilyich, and have it be deep and rich with religious meaning, have it be almost a persuasive essay in fictional form, persuading people for the morality of God, and yet have it not even feel like a religious text. Have the story itself be entertaining enough to stand on its own, but then it's also packed in with all this meaning. Back to the story, though. The protagonist contrasts the Englishman with the minstrel, specifically the Englishman who got up and walked away after he came and sat in that other room, imagines where he is now sitting in his room, quote, "calmly opines about the events that are happening in China and justifies the massacres that have been done there," unquote, as opposed to the minstrel, quote, "going about for a score of years, up hill and down dale, rejoicing man's hearts with his songs, though they have jeered at him," end quote. But here's the point where the protagonist starts to wake up, quote, "No, something involuntarily said to me, you have no right to commiserate the little man, or to blame the Lord for his well-being." The Lord being the Englishman, not the Lord himself. "Who can weigh the inner happiness which is found in the soul of each of these men?" End quote. Quote, "In his soul there is no reproach, no anger, no regret," end quote. The protagonist, seeing that the minstrel was not bitter at all for not having received anything that day, is something that moves him during his inner reflection here. Quote, "And who knows what is transpiring in the hearts of all those men in all those opulent, brilliant rooms? Who knows if they all have as much unencumbered, sweet delight in life," end quote. Quote, "Endless are the mercy and wisdom of him, capital H, who has permitted and formed all these contradictions, only to thee, miserable little worm of the dust, audaciously, carelessly attempting to fathom his laws. Only to thee do they seem like contradictions," end quote. Once again reminds you of the Book of Job, doesn't it? And then I think this is the most important line of the story, and it's put at the very end here, quote, "Thou also, with thy petty, ridiculous anger against the waiters, thou hast also disturbed the harmonious craving for the eternal and infinite," end quote. This part is so crucial. It is self-reflection. It is realizing the wrong that he himself, the protagonist, has done. Tolstoy is showing the reader by example how to self-reflect. And for that matter, something else I want to get into. Two of the Prophet's Bible authors describe a vision of what heaven itself looks like. They describe the throne of God, and they describe angels all around singing one word over and over again. The two prophets, by the way, are Isaiah and the Apostle John. Of course, John towards the end of his life writing the book of Revelation. What do you think this one word is? Bible trivia, I'll give you a minute. Can you guess? Can you guess? Holy, holy, holy. Now take a moment and think about the definition for holy. Once again, pause here, think about it, come up with your own answer. Think really hard about it. The answer to that, if you look at the Hebrew origin to the word, when the ancient Israelites said it, they would have meant set aside for a specific purpose. It would have been very similar to the modern English word, if you've ever heard in a business context, dedicated. So if there is a dedicated workstation, it's a workstation for a specific purpose. In electric, if there's a dedicated circuit, it's a circuit that feeds one device and one device only. Well, the word holy in ancient Hebrew is very similar. So if you have a cup, for example, and if you only use that cup for drinking water, no other drink, no juice, no soda. Other cups you can have juice or soda, coffee, whatever you want, but this cup is only for water, no other liquid. That cup would be the holy cup, not holy in a religious context, but holy meaning dedicated. These angels in heaven are singing that God is holy, meaning he's dedicated solely to one purpose. That one purpose, can anyone guess it? 3, 2, 1, goodness. One of the reasons it was so bad when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they already knew about goodness. They were living in literal paradise. They were personal friends with God himself, God the Father himself, who came down in physical form visible to them and talked with them on a regular basis. So if they're eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, well, they already have a knowledge of good. So what are they gaining a knowledge of? They're learning about evil. They're learning how to sin. They're learning about all the impure, improper desires that are possible to be in the human heart. They are separating themselves from their ability to be immersed in this totally good environment that God has crafted specifically for them. Now, as long as we're talking definitions, what do you think is the definition of good? I'll give you some time. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Trick question. I don't think good even deserves a definition. I think it should be just self-evident meaning. It's impossible to write down a perfect definition for the word good. I have heard a few pretty fitting, pretty apt definitions for the word good. Google was telling me it's an adjective to be desired or approved of. The second definition I'm seeing here, having the qualities required for a particular role. That second definition is closer to the one my pastor told me. In fact, almost identical. Good is something that fulfills its intended purpose. But as for me, I think goodness is just that powerful a concept that its meaning should be self-evident without need or even without possibility of using human words to write down any kind of definition for that. And that whole spiel I just went on about Adam and Eve and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that's why I thought it was so powerful when Tolstoy leaves off the story with the protagonist self-reflecting and realizing, quote, "Thou hast also disturbed the harmonious craving for the eternal and the infinite," end quote.